Imagine pulling open your fridge today and seeing, well, a whole lot of nothing. Now imagine the government handing you a little book of stamps and telling you that's the only way you're getting a slice of bacon or a bag of sugar. That wasn't some dystopian movie. That was the real deal for folks during World War II. But here's the kicker. Our parents and grandparents didn't just roll over and play dead. They got clever in ways that would make a modern shopper's head spin. They had grit, they had moxie, and they knew how to make a dollar stretch until it yelled. Just a quick heads up. This video is for historical and educational purposes only. We're looking at how they did things back then, but don't go trying these exact chemical swaps today without doing your homework on modern safety standards. We're going way past those famous victory gardens today. We're digging into that bottom of the junk drawer ingenuity, the behind-the-curtain tricks that turned not enough into plenty to go around. This is about the savvy, the hustle, and the sheer stubbornness of the homefront cook. It wasn't exactly gourmet, but man, it was genius. The first rule of a wartime kitchen, there was no such thing as a leftover, everything was just an ingredient for the next go-round. The most famous example was the perpetual soup pot, but these ladies took it to the next level. Say you had a Sunday roast, and let's be honest, it was probably a lot smaller than you'd like. Monday, you sliced it thin for dinner. Tuesday, you took the scraps and minced them into a hash with some spuds. Wednesday, you took that bone, and whatever was clinging to it, and simmered it for a soup base. By Thursday, that soup might get thickened with oatmeal to become a gravy for some dumplings. Every single molecule of flavor was squeezed out. A cook's skill wasn't measured by some fancy French recipe, it was measured by how many different meals she could spin out of one main dish. It was basically kitchen magic, and it worked like a charm. Baking turned into a high-stakes chemistry experiment. With sugar, butter, and eggs all rationed to the hilt, you couldn't just whip up a cake like you used to. That's when home bakers turned into MacGyvers of the kitchen. They had to know exactly what each ingredient did. Needed some sweetness, but didn't have the sugar points. Pureed dates or prunes stepped up to the plate, and they kept the cake moist too. Needed fat, but didn't have butter. They used rendered bacon grease or vegetable shortening. It might have tasted a little interesting, but it got the job done. They even used flax eggs, a mix of flaxseed and water, or mashed bananas as a binder. These weren't just random guesses, they were calculated swaps. A wartime cookbook read more like a lab manual than a recipe book, and you only got one shot at it. Wasting ingredients was a sin, space was tight, so every item in the pantry had to earn its keep 10 times over. Oatmeal wasn't just for your breakfast bowl. It was a meat extender in meatloaf, a thickener for your gravy, and the base for homemade snacks. Powdered milk was a real lifesaver too. It was a drink, sure, but it was also the secret to making cream soups and sauces without the actual cream. The ultimate MVP though, the humble potato. It was a vegetable, a starch, and a tool all rolled into one. Grated potato could hold fish cakes together. Potato water, the starchy stuff left over after boiling, was used to thicken up breads. They even dried and ground the peels to stretch out their flour. When you look at a wartime pantry, you're not looking at food, you're looking at a toolbox. Now, your ration book was yours, but the community's resources, that was a shared pool. An incredible, under-the-table barter system popped up. It was the original social network, and it ran on trust and tomatoes. If your family had a big apple tree but you were fresh out of sugar for jelly, you'd trade a few bushels with the neighbor who had extra sugar but a garden that had gone south. A skilled seamstress might mend your work clothes in exchange for some of your canned beans. Kids were the couriers, hightailing it back and forth with goods and messages. This system did more than just move food. It built a web of folks looking out for one another. Checking on an elderly neighbor wasn't just being neighborly, it was strategic. They might have a skill or a tool you desperately needed. Your social capital was worth just as much as the cash in your wallet. Canning usually gets all the glory, but drying food was the quiet, low-energy workhorse of the era. Without fancy dehydrators, people used what they had: air, sun, and a little bit of elbow grease. Old stories tell of homes with makeshift drying racks, tucked near wood stoves or up in warm attics. Sliced fruits, veggies, even herbs were laid out on clean cloths. The slow-drying process concentrated the flavors and kept the food good without needing precious sugar, vinegar, or fuel for canning. Dried apple rings became a chewy snack for the grandkids, and dried beans were the backbone of every winter soup. It was low-tech and high reward. Basically, preservation in its most old-school form. Let's talk about the real mind game of it all. This wasn't just about filling bellies. It was about outsmarting the shortage on a psychological level. How do you keep your chin up when every meal feels like a puzzle? That's where the fake-it-till-you-make-it mentality kicked in. Take presentation, for example. A meal made of scraps and stretched ingredients could feel pretty depressing. But if you took the time to plate it nice, use the good tablecloth and give it a fancy name, suddenly it felt like a special occasion. Potato surprise sounds a whole lot better than leftover mash with bits in it, doesn't it? It was a mental hack. They were dressing up necessity to look like a choice. Then there were the mock foods, kitchen alchemy at its finest. With real cream and sugar gone, cooks made mock whipped cream by beating chilled evaporated milk with a splash of vanilla. Mock apple pie used crushed crackers and lemon juice to trick the tongue into thinking there were apples in there. Was it a dead ringer for the real thing? Not even close. But it was close enough to give people the comfort of a familiar treat. It was about keeping things normal through a little bit of illusion. One of the most critical yet unsung methods was seed saving. The Victory Garden wasn't just a one-and-done project. To make sure they stayed resilient, gardeners became amateur scientists. They'd save seeds from their toughest, best-producing plants, the tomato that didn't get sick, or the bean that grew the longest. They'd swap these champion seeds with the folks down the street. Over time, they created local varieties that were tough as nails and perfectly suited for their own dirt and weather. This wasn't just gardening, it was grassroots food security. They were playing the long game in a world that was stuck on just getting through the next day. Water conservation in the kitchen was also a big deal. That water you used to boil your spuds or rinse your greens, you didn't just dump that down the drain. Once it cooled off, that nutrient-rich gray water was carried straight out to the Victory Garden. Every drop that could feed a plant was saved. It turned the kitchen and the garden into one big loop. Wasting water meant wasting your future dinner, and we can't forget the containers. Nothing was single-use back then. An old tin can became a scoop, a candle mold, or a little cover to protect a seedling from the frost. Glass jars were washed and reused until they practically fell apart. Butter wrappers were saved to grease up baking pans, and even waxed paper was smoothed out and used again and again. The whole idea of disposable just didn't exist. Every object had 9 lives, and its final life was usually spent helping put food on the table. All of this points to one big idea. Knowledge was the ultimate currency. The most valuable thing you could own wasn't a hidden stash of sugar, it was the know-how. Knowing how to tell if a jar was sealed right, knowing which wild greens were safe to eat, knowing how to nurse a sick chicken or mend a burlap sack. This wisdom was passed down, mostly by the women and the elders, in a living network. It was taught to the kids not in a classroom but by doing, shelling peas, kneading dough, and sorting seeds. You weren't just feeding the family for the night, you were giving the next generation the tools to survive anything. So what's the real takeaway from all this cleverness? It's that resilience isn't about having a huge stockpile, it's about your skill set and your mindset. Those families weren't just sitting around waiting for the war to end so things could go back to normal. They were busy building a new normal that could handle the pressure. They proved that real security comes from being adaptable, sticking with your community, and having a deep, practical understanding of the world right outside your back door. In our world of fast food and instant delivery, it's easy to forget that. But their legacy is a masterclass in focusing on what you can control and wringing every last bit of possibility out of it. It really makes you look at your own kitchen and your own neighbors with a fresh set of eyes, doesn't it? Looking back at these strategies, the mock foods, the seed saving, or that neighborhood barter system, which one do you think was the real secret sauce for their success? Drop a comment below and let me know what you think.